I like to be conscientious of those who are here on time, and we can get started.
All right. It'd be terrific. Thank you all. Thank you for participating. Thank you for taking the time. It's a privilege to be here. In her memoir, the person you see on the screen, Golda Meir, began the chapter about the Yom Kippur War by saying, quote, "Israel's enemies must know that what happened on October 6, 1973 will never, ever recur." And for 50 years, she was right. 50 years ago, Golda Meir sat in her office, dazed, chain smoking, trying to process what she had just been told. Everything she'd been told up to that point was wrong. Egypt and Syria were going on the attack. There were practically no Israeli soldiers in the field to stop them, and it would take 48 hours to mobilize. But our story actually begins 6 years before. Many of you watching this will actually be old enough to remember. We all know the story. The Arab armies massed at the border. Then, in a stunning turn of events, Israel won the war in just 6 days. The war began on a Monday morning and it ended the following Shabbat morning. The Shabbos before the war, people were praying in shul for the survival of the Jewish state. The Shabbat after, one New York rabbi said, "Hey, you know, I was away this past week on vacation. Did anything happen in Israel while I was gone?" Well, something happened, all right. And what happened was this. The state of Israel was 4 times larger than it had been a week before. I have to turn that off. My apologies. I thought I had this turned off. I apologize.
No worries. While you're turning it off, I just want to make sure that everybody understands. For those who didn't read the background, if you can even just show your book for a minute so that people have a little bit of a context. And first of all, thank you on behalf of the Unity Through Diversity Institute for sharing with us your book, as well as the implications for today. I interviewed Uri on the New Books Network, as I mentioned a moment ago, and said we have to continue the conversation for our people, and that's why we invited Sammy and Reconnectar and Jeannie Milgram, and just we think it's an important point, particularly where we are today, and the fact that he, over 20 years, visited the battlefields, interviewed veterans, and reviewed thousands of pages of declassified records from the Yom Kippur War, from the 1973 war, helps him to put things into context. So thank you. You jumped in without me allowing me to say thank you. So I wanted to make sure we say thank you at the beginning as well as at the end. And now people came to hear you, so I will go out.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption from the phone. I actually did turn it. It was my laptop that was on, and anyway.
That happens.
Apologies. Anyway, after the 6-day war, the state of Israel was 4 times larger than it had been the week before. The city of Yerushalayim was united under Jewish control for the very first time since the year 63 BCE, over 2,000 years before. Israel had a unity government. The unity government was headed up by the man you see in the middle, Levi Eshkol, and the man you see on the right, which is Menachem Begin. Together, they had 108 out of the 120 seats in the Knesset, an all-time record, never to be surpassed. That government voted unanimously to trade the whole Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights in return for a peace treaty. What was the Arab response? Well, the man you see on your screen was Gamal Abdel Nasser. He responded infamously with the 3 no's: no negotiation, no recognition, and most importantly, no peace. Nasser was an incredibly charismatic individual. It was said that Muhammad conquered the Arab world with the sword and that Nasser did it with the radio. Nasser coined a battle cry, which he repeated in practically every speech: "That which was taken by force will be returned by force." Well, Nasser never got the chance. He died of a heart attack in September of 1970 and was replaced by this man, his vice president, Anwar Sadat. Nobody expected Sadat to become president. Nasser only named him vice president after he had a failed coup attempt. Sadat only had one thing going for him. He was totally loyal to Nasser. He actually only defied him once. It was right after the 6-day war when Nasser suggested democratic reforms. Sadat said, "Oh, Mr. President, this is not the time to experiment with these crazy Western ideas. We need your leadership. In other words, the only time Sadat defied Nasser was when Nasser suggested diluting his own power. Or to put it another way, Sadat was the only man in Egypt that Nasser could appoint vice president without having to hire a food taster. Everyone held Sadat in contempt. Elliot Richardson represented America at Nasser's funeral. He came back home and said, this guy Sadat won't even last 6 weeks. Henry Kissinger was said to have called him a buffoon. Well, he was no buffoon. He was actually one of the best leaders Egypt ever had. He sat down to plan out a military plan with his generals. And right away, they ran into a problem, and it was this. The fighter jet, the Israeli Air Force. The fighter jet is the wonder weapon that allows Israel, in those days, a nation of just 3 million, barely larger than Brooklyn, New York, 3 million to hold off combined Arab populations, which, depending on how you count it, equaled 80 million or more. So the worst part for the Egyptians wasn't even that. It was this, the Suez Canal. Crossing any body of water is one of the hardest things to do in military matters. In World War II, the USSR gave out a quarter of all their highest awards, called the Hero of the Soviet Union. They gave out a quarter of them just for the fight to get over the Dnieper River, which Ukraine today calls the Dnipro. Why is it so difficult? Well, in the earliest stages, the men have to paddle across with nothing but the weapons they can carry, and they've got to face tanks and artillery and planes. It's a very difficult situation, and the only way to accomplish it is with the element of surprise. So that's what they had to cross. In 1969, a well-dressed man entered the Israeli embassy in London, and he offered to trade secrets in return for money, a lot of money. It's the man you see circled above. His name was Ashraf Marwan. Marwan was Nasser's son-in-law. He was married to his favorite daughter, Mona. That's the picture of them on their wedding day. Sadat wanted to maintain ties with the Nasser family, so he made Marwan one of his aides. Marwan backed Sadat in a failed coup in 1971, so Sadat rewarded him by naming him his chief of staff. In that position, he literally saw everything that came across Sadat's desk. How much did the Israelis pay him? Well, according to published reports, the Israelis paid him the staggering sum of $25 million. That's adjusted for inflation. By contrast, if you want to put that into context, the spy that we know of that got the most money of all time in American history was Aldrich Ames, the CIA traitor. The Russians only paid him $5 million. Espionage is not a very well-paying industry, I have to tell you. The most important thing that Marwan told the Israelis was something that literally took on a life of its own. It became known as the Concepcia. The Concepcia, or the concept, said that Syria would not go to war without Egypt, which turned out to be true, but that Egypt would not go to war unless and until it got advanced fighter jets that could contend with the Israeli Air Force. In those days, the MiG-23 and the MiG-25. Since those fighter jets were not due for delivery until 1974, and since it took about a year or two to train the pilots, the Israelis thought they had some breathing room in 1973. Well, trouble was, Sadat had conceptions of his own. He was literally at the end of his rope in 1972. It was the 5th anniversary of the 67 war. A group of officers held themselves up in a mosque in downtown Cairo and demanded action. A group of writers sent an open letter. They demanded war. Sadat knew his time was running out. But how do you launch a surprise attack? Well, this is how you do it. The pictures you see here are from the Soviet surprise invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the so-called Prague Spring. So what did the Soviets do? What they did was they brought their army to the border, and they would mobilize and do military exercises, and then they would send them home. And then they would bring them back time later, do more military exercises along the border, and then bring them home. And they did it again and again and again and again until in 1968, they said, okay, now go on the attack. The brilliance of that system is that it's impossible for the enemy to know whether it's a real attack or whether they're just training. It's possible to see, your enemy's capability, but it's impossible to know their intentions because only a few people at the very, very top know what the actual plans are. The Egyptians did the exact same thing. They mobilized and they brought their army to the canal and they engaged in exercises, and then they demobilized. They sent them back home. Then they sent them back to the canal. They did military exercise, sent them back home. They did this 22 times between January 1, 1973 and October 1, 1973. Of the 8,000 POWs that Israel would eventually capture in the war, only one knew about the planned attack on October the 3rd, and practically everybody else only found out about it on the morning of October the 6th. Now, there were signs of war, but in military matters, or I should say intelligence matters today, the challenge is not a lack of information, it is an overabundance of information. In those days, even without computers, the Israelis were taking in 10,000 pieces of data every single month. So yeah, the signs were there, but they were buried a few needles inside this massive haystack. Now, Marwan did warn the Israelis the night before. So unlike America and Pearl Harbor, and unlike most of the others who only found out about the attack when the bombs dropped, the Israelis actually had 10 hours of warning. But it begs the question, why did Marwan wait till literally the very last minute before he warned the Israelis? So an Israeli master spy named Rafi Eitan once said, "You must always remember there are no double agents. There are only triple agents. There's the nation they serve, the nation they betray, and then there's that highest loyalty of all, which is to themselves." In other words, what he meant by that was Marwan was in it for the money, but he was still an Egyptian. So his goal was just to give the minimum amount of information to the Israelis without having that flow of money cut off. So he waited till the last minute, and that's when he told them. Well, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow description of the Yom Kippur War. For that, you got to read the book. Suffice it to say, Israel did win the war in the end. It was bloody. It was a miracle. It took some unbelievable gambles. Golda was also the hero of that war. She stood firm before pressure from Kissinger, from others. But that's what brings us to the parallels to what happened today. What went wrong on October the 7th, 2023? So we're still in the first stages of understanding what happened. And there's going to be a commission of inquiry. But in the meantime, based just on the initial reports, it looks like Hamas did in 2023 exactly what the Egyptians did in 1973. They would go to the fence and they would riot and they would set off fires and sometimes even shoot and firecrackers, and then they would go home. And then they came back to the fence and they did it again, and then they went home. And they did it again and again and again and again until on October the 7th, they said, okay, this time go on the attack. The man you see in this picture, his name is Ali Barakat. He's a senior Hamas official. He gave an interview on Russian television, and he said that the number of people who knew about the attack could be counted on the fingers of just one hand. As it turns out, it looks like there were only 3 people who knew about it. Yehia Sinwar, I'm sure you've heard about, his brother Mohammed Sinwar, and then there were 2 others, Mohammed Def and a guy named Marwan Issa. Marwan Issa, if you're following the news, it looks like the Israelis recently managed to kill him. But the bottom line is, there were only 3 or 4 people in Hamas that actually knew there was going to be an attack. Now, there was a CNN story right after the attack happened where they basically said, how could the Israelis be so stupid? Didn't they see the Hamas terrorist training? There were all those films. Didn't they see them along the fence? Well, the answer is sure they saw them, but they did this over and over and over, so it was impossible to know whether it was going to be an attack or not. I saw a CIA operative on MSNBC, and he said, this failure shows that Israel should have invested more in human intelligence. They invested too much in technology. Okay, this is complete nonsense. All the technology did its job. In fact, it's precisely because of that technology that the Israeli casualty toll so far has been a fraction of what most people thought it was going to be. Even the much maligned fence that I'm sure many of you have heard of, it did its job. The fence was designed to do 2 things: give early warning, and it did, and prevent Hamas from digging tunnels from Gaza into Israel. It looks like it did that too. Hamas has dug over 350 miles of tunnels inside Gaza, but none of those tunnels, so far as we know, managed to make it under the fence or around the fence. So the fence did its job. So if that's the case, what went wrong? The answer is, what went wrong was there was a concepcia. It was in many ways the exact same thing as what happened in 1973. So after the 73 war, the head of Israel's military intelligence, or one of them anyway, a man named Moshe Bogi Alon, said, that's it. No more concepcias, no more analytical frameworks. We look at everything with fresh eyes. We don't have any core assumptions. Well, the problem is they found out very quickly that it's impossible to run any organization without certain core assumptions. It's impossible to live your life without core assumptions. Let me give an extreme example. You come to the corner, you want to cross the street. You wait, the light changes, the little green man comes up, then you step off the curb, and someone runs you over. Now, God forbid. Now, some people would say, well, didn't you see there were cars there? Well, the answer is sure, I saw cars there, but I had a concepcia. My concepcia, my core assumption was that the driver would stop for the red light the way everybody does. Now, that's admittedly an extreme example, but let me give a more concrete example, because this is probably the best analogy to what happened. That is a picture of the Israeli team in Munich in 1972. In 1972, the Olympics were just completely exposed. We all know what happened after that. Black September came, they took hostages, and they ended up murdering 11 Israelis, some athletes and some coaches. Horrible tragedy. So the question is, why was the Olympics so completely undefended? The answer is they had a concepcia. The Germans did. They said, who would attack the Olympics? Why would someone even do that? And if someone had come to the Germans before and said, hey, guys, you got a real problem here, someone might attack it, they would have said, you're crazy. Why would somebody do that? Wouldn't it hurt their cause to attack an Olympics? How does it help a cause? So it turns out that that's true of most groups. But when it comes to the Palestinians, there is this coalition of evil that just always supports them. So there's no bad publicity when you're a Palestinian. All publicity is good publicity. Because again, the UN, the media, academia, they always support them no matter what. So by engaging in these crazy attacks, they put themselves back on the global agenda. And no one would have seen that before 1972. So what was the concepcia in 2023? Well, that, as you all recognize, is Ariel Sharon. That is him back during the 1973 war, standing on the canal. But as you all know, later on, he became prime minister. Under international law, when you are an occupier, you occupy territory, you have to take care of the population. However, once you withdraw, you have no responsibility at all. Ariel Sharon, as prime minister, ordered disengagement. Under disengagement, Israel pulled out completely. That is the picture you see before you. But once it did that, it had every right to say to Gaza, guys, we're done with you. You're on your own. But Israel didn't do that. Because Israel really is a light unto nations, it kept supplying Gaza. Here are the statistics. What you see there is the Kerem Shalom crossing. So in 2022, the most recent full year before the war, Israel supplied Gaza with 5.7 billion gallons of water, without which Gaza would die of thirst. 67,000 trucks filled with supplies, 2/3 of Gaza's electricity, fuel for the other 1/3. There's a small power plant in Gaza. Now, Gaza and Palestinians got to pay for all this. Well, how do they pay for it? Answer, 18,500 Palestinians had licenses to work in Israel and bring home a paycheck. This is utterly unprecedented in the history of the world. One side supplying the other in the middle of a war. It would be as if 18,500 Germans were working in America during World War II so that we could send paychecks home and they can buy supplies that we send to Berlin. Utterly unheard of. That's where the concepcia came along. No one thought that Hamas would cut off their only economic lifeline. No one thought that Hamas would blow all this up. No one thought they would sit down and commit an act of national suicide. Here is a newspaper from Israel that appeared just 9 days before the attack. The man here was Tal Levrom, who is a very well-known Israeli military analyst, works for the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv. This is what he wrote. Now, this is only 9 days before the attack. Israel and Hamas are not interested in a military confrontation. Israel's defense establishment sees this in the way that Hamas is behaving. Hamas was then sending people to the border fence rioting, as I described before. Hamas could send thousands of people to the fence to riot, and not just dozens or hundreds of people. Hamas could send fire balloons, and of course they can fire rockets. There are many ways to explain Hamas's actions. They are primarily done to put pressure on the Qataris and the international community to get more money and get a greater economic easing. Now, that is what makes this so scary. Okay, I'm going to just jump back for a second. Hamas's leadership sat down and made a conscious decision to commit national suicide. And make no mistake about it, they commit an act of national suicide. Those 18,500 Palestinians that used to work in Israel, they better get their resumes together because they're not coming back. The 5.7 billion gallons of water, the 67,000 trucks, the electricity, forget about it. It's finished. They are going to be cut off completely. Gaza is now going to become a ward of the international community living on humanitarian assistance, just like the Arabs in Syria, northwest Syria, in Idlib, are now living on humanitarian assistance as well. Nobody thought they would do this. And Gazan leaders, Hamas leaders, are giving interviews, and they're saying things like, well, what do we care about living? We don't care about that. We just want to die. We just want to kill. And one of them said, look, it took 2.5 million Vietnamese had to be killed to drive America out of Vietnam, and 3.5 million Afghans had to be killed to drive the USSR and America out of Afghanistan. We don't mind killing 1 million or 2 million of our own. We just want to kill the Jews. And that's why this story is so much larger than Israel and Gaza. How do you deter someone that says they're willing to commit suicide? How do you deter someone who doesn't really care about living and is actually more interested in dying? Now, I have to say, there was one guy who actually called it. And it's this man. Looks like a real sweetheart. His name is Michael Ben-Ari. Now, he belongs to Itamar Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power Party, the most right-wing party in Israel. You've heard a lot about Itamar Ben-Gvir. But wait, this guy is to the right of Itamar Ben-Gvir. He is a real radical. He's so radical that in 2019, the Israeli Board of Elections wouldn't let him run. They said, this guy's just too crazy. That's a really high bar to clear. There are supporters of Al-Qaeda that have run and even served in Israel's Knesset. He is the one guy that called this. He said, you're all out of your minds. Hamas doesn't want to live. They just want to kill. And he was dismissed as a racist. They said, oh, they want to live just like we do. Don't they want to raise their kids? He got it right. And I have to admit, I got it wrong. One of the things that I wrote about, that my book came out on August the 29th, before the October 7 attack. And I was writing down the lessons. And one of the lessons I wrote down, and this is before, was you have to have core assumptions, but you have to question those core assumptions. I have to confess, I almost certainly would have gotten it wrong too. I wouldn't have thought that they would commit an act of national suicide. But there's one more point in all of this that needs to be discussed, which is the idea of a cost-benefit analysis. And that's really where the Israelis failed. Let's go back to Munich. If someone had said to the German security officials, you really need to have security, okay? Think for a minute what it takes to secure an Olympics. You got like 12,000 athletes and their family members and thousands of judges and all these venues. And then the biggest part, which is, of course, the fans. There are literally hundreds of thousands of spectators that come to watch this. Defending an Olympics is just an absolutely monumental task. It costs, I don't even know what, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars. That is not the kind of money you spend to be safe rather than sorry. Same thing in 1973. Mobilizing an army is not a small thing. It brought the economy to a standstill, and it had the ability to spark a crisis all by itself. So again, cost-benefit analysis, not mobilizing the army wasn't so crazy. But on October 7, 2023, this was really where the mistake was made. Israel had enough forces just in the field to get them up on the line without mobilizing reservists, just what they had. But the leaders were so sure, the military leaders, that nothing was going to happen, that they didn't even bring these guys up on the line. The only price would have been that they would have ruined the weekend. It was a holiday weekend. They would have ruined the holiday weekend of some soldiers. And that, by the way, is why these guys are probably all going to lose their jobs. Straight down the chain. The chief of staff should have called the men up because, you always have to worry, what happens if I happen to be wrong? I think I'm right, and I think I'm acting rationally, and I don't think the other guys are going to attack, but what if I'm wrong? And if the price, the cost is so small, well, then you really ought to think about covering yourself. But lastly, I just want to make one final point. And again, it's what I was touching upon before. It's just how dangerous a moment this is. Hamas is supported by Iran. They have shown us that radical Islam doesn't really want to live so much as it wants to kill. What does this mean for Iran getting a bomb? Can Iran be deterred? Do they live by the same rules as Russia, China, and all the other countries that have the bomb? It's really not so clear, but the one thing we can all agree upon is a chill wind is blowing right now. And unfortunately, I have to end on a bad note, but that's the only note to end upon. And with that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. That was a lot put into a very little time. I appreciate that. So one of the things, I don't see questions here yet. Please do throw them into the chat when you're ready. But one of the, you said that all the technology was working well at the beginning of both wars, basically. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Absolutely. Okay, so the technology has been much maligned. What was the technology? The technology was the fence, which I already discussed. Right. Okay, but there's other technologies. There's something you're going to hear about. It's called trophy. Trophy is a sort of iron dome, an anti-missile missile, but it's attached to every tank and armored personnel carrier. Okay, when the war began, a bunch of American generals came to Israel, and they had a lot of experience in urban warfare, and they said, expect to take 20 killed per day. An Israeli commentator said, we're going to find out if the Israeli public can handle 50 killed per day. By the way, the Yom Kippur War was like 122 killed per day. But that was a different war with tanks and planes, okay? As it turns out so far, counting the ceasefire, counting before they came in, just the ground campaign, it's been less than 2 a day that have been killed. And about 10% of those were friendly fire casualties. Unfortunately, Israel accidentally killing their own. Now, early in the war, it was much higher. It was 16%. They've gotten better at it. They've reduced it to like 6 or 7%. But the point is, the number of casualties have been a tiny fraction of what people expected. Partly it's because of this thing called trophy. It's partly because, of course, Iron Dome, which is picking the rockets out of the sky. It's partly because of other things that we probably don't know about. They clearly have found ways to uncover tunnels that, again, we don't know about. They're doing a great job using dogs. They've done, saved a lot of lives using dogs. Bottom line, you really can't point to a technology that has failed. What's failed is the military plan. What's failed was the conceptia. The idea of, are they going to attack us? And the arrogance, I have to say, of the officers not even planning for, what if they do anyway?
Yeah, that's a little sad. But let's at least talk a little bit about how the Yom Kippur War ended, because I think that's a fun little story, and maybe it'll help us at least be a little more positive towards if we can end this one in some kind of way as well.
So the Yom Kippur War ended because the Israelis took some unbelievably wild chances. The first one was Golda only had one spare division, and the choices were leave it to defend Jerusalem, from a potential attack by Jordan, or send it up north and use it to drive back the Syrians. Now, all the intelligence analysts said there's no way Jordan is going to enter the war, but of course they just gotten the whole thing wrong. They said neither would Egypt and Syria. Golda threw the dice. She sent that last division up north. For 2 nerve-shattering weeks, Jerusalem was open, exposed to attack. At one point, the Jordanians even played psychological warfare. They sent engineers to go scout out crossing points along the Jordan River, but she never wavered, and that division is the one that pushed the Syrians back. In the south, along the Suez Canal, the Israelis only had 650 tanks. They sent 400 of them across the canal. Now, think about what that means. If the bridge had been shot out, those 400 tanks would have been lost. And Moshe Dayan said, if we lose these tanks, we're going to be fighting on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. But they did it anyway. They surrounded the Egyptian army. Kissinger pressured Israel to not surround the Egyptian Third Army. Golda said, I don't care what you want. I'm going to win this war. I'm going to do it. Kissinger said, you might touch off World War III. She said, I don't care. Go fight World War III. We're not going to lose. All this talk about, the greatest tension between Israel and America ever, don't believe a word of it. The acrimony between Golda and Kissinger actually really surprised me when I read it. All this stuff was declassified only in the last 10 years. They had some really, really hot conversations. But in the end, Golda toughed it out. Israel won the war. Because of that, they entered into an agreement that basically gave Egypt the veneer of victory. It gave them a little bit of land, but it made it impossible for them to wage another war because they had to pull all their forces way, way back so they couldn't launch another surprise attack. And that's why Anwar Sadat was faced with a pretty stark choice. Make peace with losing most of Sinai or make peace with Israel. He made peace with Israel. In Syria, the Assads were faced with the same choice. Make peace with losing the Golan Heights or make peace with Israel. They chose to lose the Golan Heights, and so they're never going to get it back.
Okay, so as you've been talking, some questions have come in, so I'm going to start reading them off, if that's okay.
Sure,
Sherry is asking, can you comment on the fear that what is happening in Gaza today will create more terrorists in the future? I don't know if you can comment on that.
Well, if you say what's going on today, as far as the fighting, my fear is that they're going to enter into a foolish hostage deal, free 1,000 or 2,000 murderers, and then send them back to Judea, Samaria, and then you could just set your watch. There'll be another war. This happened. There was a big prisoner swap in 85. It's known as the Jabril deal. Israel freed 1,150 terrorists to get back 3 soldiers. And 2 years later, there was an intifada. And Israel freed Yahya Sinwar, you're reading about in the Gilad Shalit deal. And here we are now. This repeats itself. In the 90s, Israel freed hundreds of terrorists as part of the Oslo peace process, confidence building. So we got the Al-Aqsa intifada. I mean, there are studies on this. 2/3 of these terrorists are going right back into the business of killing people. So that would be my biggest fear.
And we're having you put on all different hats because I think this is more of an advertising type or PR type of hat. But Ellen is asking if you can comment on the fact that the world is focusing on fatalities in Gaza and not in Israel.
Oh, it's real simple. It's called hypocrisy. If there were no hypocrisy, there'd be no foreign policy. The good news is that it's only words. At bottom, I really believe this. Everybody knows what's going on here. Don't believe the nonsense that, America protects Israel in the international forum. It doesn't. That's not really true. America protects Israel from only one thing, and that's declarations of condemnation in the UN Security Council. That's it. It can veto that. By the way, the General Assembly condemns Israel all the time. The General Assembly condemned Israel for signing a peace treaty with Egypt, if you can believe that. It's General Assembly Resolution 3470. Kurt Waldheim, when he was Secretary General of the UN, condemned Israel for rescuing hostages in Entebbe. This is true. So it's only words. I don't care. And as far as sanctions go, if countries want to impose sanctions on Israel, they can impose sanctions. They don't need America's permission. They don't need the UN's permission. But nobody does it because at bottom, everybody knows what's going on here. It's only words. When it comes to anything, this is the unholy bargain that the international community has entered into with the Arab world. If you want words, we'll give you all the words you want. But if you want something real, if you want us to ban Israeli athletes from the Olympics or Israel from Israel, forget about it. We're not doing it because we know what's going on here. Also, when Israeli spies get caught in European countries, or when Israel gets caught, for example, they killed a guy named Mahmoud al-Mabkhouk in Dubai back in 2010. And the Dubai police had a very, very advanced capability that Israel underestimated. And they were able, with their cameras, to show who the Mossad agents were, if you remember. And they showed that Israel forged passports from 6 different countries. Countries usually get really, really mad when you monkey around with their passports. All 6 let it go. Because at bottom, everybody knows what's going on here. So there will be symbolism, but it's only going to be that.
Okay. So now Gregory has an interesting twist to the original question. What information should have led to spoiling the weekend, in quotes, by posting the soldiers on October 6th? Were the defenses in good order earlier in October? Is it just because it happened to be in the middle of the holidays? I'm interpreting.
Good question. This was an epic failure. People are going to be studying it and talking about it for decades. And right now it hasn't been investigated, so we're just going by what's been in the press so far. The failure was at every level. By the way, there might have been a huge counterintelligence failure because the terrorists knew everything. They knew where all the servers were. They killed 3 colonels that one day. That didn't even happen in the Yom Kippur War. And it's because they knew in each base where their living quarters were, where they worked. They knew everything. So it might just be that the Iranians hacked into something, or it could be that Israel had a monumental intelligence failure. I could tell you a quick story. There was a guy named Ali Hassan Salameh, known as the Black Prince. He was the head of Black September who masterminded the Munich massacre. And the Israelis really wanted to kill this guy. And they sent a Mossad agent who got friendly with him. And while they were there, at one point, Ali Hassan Salameh said to this guy we thought was any old person, but he was a Mossad agent, you know, those Israelis, they are so smart. We were never able to get one Israeli to sell us information in all the years. So that's what they're used to. Something broke down. The other thing that broke down was the whole plan was wrong, because what happened was the soldiers went into their bunkers to avoid the rockets. But then when they came out, the Hamas guys were already there. Usually, if you're in a military fort, you have all the advantages. They were supposed to be in concrete reinforced places, you know, with a slit so that the gun goes out, and they would have annihilated them. But they didn't even plan for this because it never occurred to anyone that Hamas would launch this massive ground invasion. It was a failure of imagination. I'll say another thing. You know, I showed you Michal Ben Ari. Israel, this is one of the things that people are looking at. All the people who make it to the senior ranks of Israel's defense establishment all tend to be left-wing people. You might remember that movie a few years ago, The Guardians, Shomrei Asaf. It was where they interviewed 6 former heads of Shabak, which is Israel's FBI, counterintelligence agency. All 6 were radical left-wing people, every single one. And people were scratching their heads going, wait a minute, how can this be? How can it be that the most left-wing 20% always seem to be the commanders? It just statistically, it's impossible. It must be that you have to be left-wing to get advancement. And one of the most radical right-wing Israelis, his name was Yisrael Eldar. He was the head, he's a doctor. He was the head of Israel's medical corps. And after he got out of the medical corps, he became a very right-wing politician. And he said he never spoke politics before. And someone came over to him and said, if I had known you were so right-wing, I would have never let them put you in charge of the medical corps. And he said, you're right. And that's why I never told anybody. And so, you know, you need to hear from the Michal Ben Aris. I'm no fan of Itamar Ben-Gvir, don't get me wrong. But this is where diversity matters. But diversity is both ways. It's not just left-wing. You want that radical right-wing guy to sit in the room and say, wait a minute. Maybe we're projecting our thoughts on them. I wouldn't launch such an invasion. I wouldn't blow up my only economic lifeline, but maybe they would. So there's going to be a real bit of soul searching when this is over. One other thing that leaked out, they found that the Hamas guys put SIM cards, you know, the little card that goes in your cell phone. So they took Israeli SIM cards and put them in their phone the night before the attack. So that showed seemingly that they were going to go into Israel. Now, some have said that they did that before and demobilized. So it could be, again, that this was one of those things that they did, and then they went back home and did and went back home. But there were any number of things that would have tipped them off that this was possible. And I stress this again. If it meant mobilizing reservists and spending billions of dollars, that's one thing. But when the only thing you got to do is get everybody out of bed, give them rifles, get them up on the line, make sure they didn't even tell the commander of the Air Force. The commander of the Air Force knew nothing about this. He could have prepared a squadron of fighter jets, another squadron of attack helicopters, another squadron of attack drones. There was nothing. This landed like lightning on a sunny day. This was the most epic failure in the history of the Israeli army, bar none. It's going to be studied for decades. What I'm giving you is the first draft of history, but we're all sitting here waiting to see what we learn from this.
So I do also want to say that um, West Point, that one of the main people in West Point is saying how amazing Israel's army is dealing with it at post October 7th. So I do have to put in some positive there as well. I want to make sure that we have somewhat of a diverse opinion here. Nachshon is going back to your other, what you were saying though about the leaks.
Can I interrupt you on that point?
Yeah.
I'm working on another book right now. And I interviewed a really brilliant young American lieutenant colonel named Amos Fox. He teaches at West Point. He went to Harvard Law School. And we were talking, and he said, I've been talking to my friends and officers about Israel. And I said, I'm just curious. You say you're talking to your friends, you guys, you're obviously a military guy. How many of them are pro-Israel? And how many of them are pro-Palestinian? He laughed. He said, pro-Palestinian? I haven't met that guy yet. That tells you everything you need to know. The chattering classes in this country, the most radical kind of left-wing 5%, make about 80% of the noise and win almost 100% of the prizes. And that's kind of what the next book is about.
Well, that'll definitely be interesting. We'll have to take a look at that. But Nachshon is going back to the original leaks that you were talking about. What do you think of the famous New York Times article asserting that multiple younger Israeli intelligence analysts, mostly female, reported seeing many Hamas military exercises in weeks just before their big October 7th attack? The Times reported that senior IDF commanders poo-pooed those reports. Also, I think New York Times reported that IDF got a copy of Hamas war plan and again refused to believe it. And those reports seem to support your conceptia theory.
Correct. So here's what happened, okay? There was a 28-year-old woman, and we don't know her name because they won't release it yet. There was a 28-year-old woman who saw a plan. Okay, they got their hands on a Hamas plan to launch this massive invasion, okay? And this woman took the plan, went to her superior and said, they might do this. And the senior said, oh, come on, cut it out. Why would they do this? They'd be cutting off their economic lifeline. Forget about it. Now, just bear in mind, militaries all have these crazy contingency plans that they keep on the shelf. I'm sure Israel has a plan to invade the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. They've got a plan to invade Syria. This is the way I'm sure America has a plan to invade Russia. Everyone has to have a contingency. You cannot manage a military operation on the fly. Everything is a plan that you take down off the shelf. So they said, look, it's aspirational, but I have to say, the 28-year-old woman herself said in an interview to the Israeli press, I didn't warn that, I think on October 7th is going to be an attack. The whole thing was just her saying, we have this plan. We're not taking it seriously. Maybe we should. Okay, that's the sum total of her warning. If she had been a man, frankly, I don't think the New York Times would have made such a big deal out of it. But again, it kind of fits into the narrative that the New York Times likes to foster, this kind of progressive narrative of, they're oppressing people of color, and they don't listen to women, and the patrimony, not the patrimony,
Patron.
No, what was the word they used in the Barbie movie? The man-dominated society, patriarchy. That's the word I was looking for.
There you go.
It fit into the wheelhouse. Again, even the 28-year-old woman herself said, she didn't give any concrete warning. And I suspect she was just as surprised as everybody else.
Okay. Thank you. This definitely helps me always to hear you again and to put things into context. I hope everybody else feels that as well. Like I said, I will send to you a link to the book, and because I will have to say this because I've said it so many times. I read it, I think the end of October, beginning of November, and I just started getting goosebumps. Like I couldn't deal with the parallels, and it was just, which is why I thank you for coming and giving that context for other people as well. But I think you really need to read the book, and we'll look forward to your next book as well. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. Much appreciated.
Thank you.